I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which I live and work, the Yuwut and Whadjuk people of the Noongar Nation. I pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging, and extend that respect to all First Nations, including Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders who may be watching today's episode.
If we need to make a change, the best way to do it is to certainly have the right thoughts, but also have the right actions, because they don't just flow one way. Thoughts don't just influence actions, they're reciprocal.
And we really need to look at that big picture. We need to look at every single aspect of someone's life to be able to put all the puzzle pieces together.
Mental illnesses aren't just bad feelings or bad thoughts, right? Depression isn't just feeling sad and not feeling like doing anything. We all have choices, and we are the only entities in the universe that can take responsibility for our choices.
Welcome to Shit's Fucked, the podcast that gets real about addiction, mental health, and everything in between. I'm Paris, and I spent 17 years battling the bottle, 10 years hooked on meth, and I also did a stint in the escorting world, which nearly cost me everything, including my life. I was lost, disconnected, and completely unrecognizable from who I once was. With both lived and professional experience, including qualifications in alcohol and other drugs, I'm here to share what I've learned along the way. Shit's Fucked isn't about offering the right way to recover. It's about showing that recovery is actually very personal. Every journey is unique, and this podcast brings you stories, insights, and practical tools to help you find what works for you. Now, just a disclaimer, we dive into some tough topics here, including addiction, all forms of abuse, trauma, mental illness, suicide, self-harm, and the realities of life in recovery. These discussions can be intense, so please take care while listening and just make sure you're in the right headspace too. Don't forget to follow or subscribe to the podcast. Your support actually helps us more than you know, and it's one of the best ways to keep these conversations going. I hope you enjoy the show. And welcome to the show, John Cuturilo. Hopefully I said that right.
All good, Paris. Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here today.
Thank you so much. So did I actually say that right? Or how do you properly say your last name?
It's Cuturilo, but we're in Australia, so we can be flexible.
Okay. Cuturilo. Yeah, I feel like that was pretty close, right?
It was good. Some people say something like Cuturilo, which is okay. At least I know they're talking about me.
I mean, take what you can get, eh?
That's the way.
So I'm going to just dive straight on in. I like to not fluff around too much at the start. So the first thing I wanted to ask you, John, was can you share your journey into psychotherapy and what motivated you to become a life coach and therapist?
I've essentially been in and out of psychotherapy for personal matters my entire life, and I've essentially spent at least half of, if not more of my life working through some kind of psychological difficulty or mental illness. So I've had a lot of contact with different psychotherapists who work in different modalities, use different approaches, have different personal attributes that have either resonated well with me or not resonated so well with me. And I believe it was in one of my early experiences where I found the problem-solving approach that the psychologist was using rather fascinating. And it always resonated with me and always appeared to me to be a type of job that I felt I could do well and that I felt I'd find rather fulfilling. And so some time ago, when I decided to change my professional direction in life, I had to make a decision about where I would go. And I realized that those early interests and impressions of how psychotherapy worked were pivotal in my decision making. I realized that was the type of job that I felt was going to be most suitable for me, but also one at which I felt I had a natural ability, and I believed I'd excel in it. So I went to university and to study psychological sciences, and then while I was actually studying, I was volunteering. I was operating my own voluntary service as a paraprofessional counsellor, emotional support figure for people all over the world, operating via the internet, which was a massively enriching experience. I learned a lot about other people. I learned a lot about culture in those experiences, and I developed my skills in a way that I don't think I would have been able to do if I had just waited until I graduated, or alternatively only work with people in Australia. Working with people from other countries certainly taught me a lot about the world. And I worked as a paraprofessional counsellor after graduating in Australia, working with people with intensive needs, usually people in the disability industry who had either illnesses that were quite severe to the extent that they had behavioural problems, and I was helping them develop behavioural plans as a paraprofessional behaviour therapist, or alternatively less intensive needs but that were still reaching the threshold of being a disability, and I was helping them to overcome the daily challenges associated with their conditions and helping them to connect to services. So there was a social work aspect to what I did as well. And after a while of doing that and still continuing my paraprofessional counselling endeavour, I decided that I had developed enough to the point that I was ready to integrate all these different experiences, my professional experience, my personal experience, my academic experience, into a comprehensive set of approaches in which I had a great amount of faith were going to be in clients' best interest. And I always knew that helping clients directly with their psychological challenges was where my talent and where my passion lay. And so I decided, after accumulating all those experiences, that it was time to finally actualize it and deliver it to Australians. And so that's how I came to be where I am now.
Amazing. What a journey. And I love that, it was your own personal journey as well that had influenced your decision to walk this new career path. So that's something that even myself, I remember for so long I wanted to do psychology, but I think just because I was in active addiction for too long, it was a little bit hard to get to uni and to study, but was always something that I found really interesting. It's such a fascinating topic. I mean, we're so complex. So there's so much to learn in that area alone, and so much that we don't understand still. So it's so fascinating. But I was going to ask you as well, like, what are the main, like you mentioned as well that there were some psychotherapists that you were engaging with that you didn't necessarily like the way that they conducted their services, or it wasn't the right fit for you personally. What are the main limitations of traditional therapy that you have identified, and how do you address that like in your work today?
Well, the main limitations in how therapy is traditionally delivered, I find, is that the approaches tend to miss parts of the problem or parts of the person. So what I tend to find happens is a lot of practitioners who are working within a strictly traditional context tend to choose a particular approach for a particular person, or just a particular approach in general. And there are a number of different therapeutic modalities that exist. In fact, I read an estimate once that at some time there were considered to be 200 of them. And they range from the traditional psychotherapy, psychoanalytic therapy of Sigmund Freud, through to Carl Rogers' person-centered therapy, through to more contemporary dialectical behavior therapy and cognitive behavioral approaches. And there are a range of them. They all have different tenets, although they do also have their similarities. But what often happens, which is something that I've been discussing in my own program a lot since I started talking about these issues, is that when somebody chooses a particular modality in which to work primarily, there requires a lot of, shall we say, mental gymnastics of taking any problem that's presented to that therapist and then trying to explain it in a way that suits the modality. So, for example, a cognitive behavioral approach is based on the fact that it's based on the idea that mental illness symptoms are a result of perpetuating irrational thoughts. So if you take that literally, and I'm not going to speculate how many therapists do take it literally, but if you take it literally, you take any problem and argue that there are rational thoughts behind it, and you basically ask the question, what are the irrational thoughts? If you take a psychoanalytic approach, then you posit that any presenting problem is because somebody had unresolved sexual needs in their childhood, and you try to work any problem into that framework. And the problem with that is that one of the key needs in psychotherapy is that the explanation that the therapist is able to offer is accessible to the client. It makes sense to them, and they can see a clear link between what the hypothetical explanation is and what they have to do to then overcome the problem. If the explanation that that therapist chooses based on working only within one modality and the problem are too divergent, and they're trying to force that explanation from their school of thought to work with the presenting problem, it's less likely that the client is actually going to be able to make sense of it, which means they're less likely to see a link with action, which means they're less likely to actually take action. The other aspect is missing the problem or missing aspects of the person. And often what happens here is the therapist listens to what the client says and then only takes a portion of what they say and then treats that as though it's the entire problem, or tells them, okay, this aspect of what you described is the problem, and then offers a simple solution for it. The problem with that is any presenting problem is most likely going to be a result of a range of intersecting factors, biological factors, factors to do with how we interact with other people, what other people have taught us, how we were raised, how we believe, what we believe about ourselves, a number of different psychological and physical factors, and they intersect. So what I try to do to overcome that problem is I've studied a range of different theories on why people develop certain problems, and even underneath the problems, what motivates us and drives us as humans, what the basic functionings of the human mind are, what the human mind, the types of conditions in which the human mind works well, the types of conditions in which it doesn't work well, why we behave, think, and feel the way we do, and how then we can relate that to specific types of problems. And then I've studied a number of different therapeutic modalities that address those problems from different perspectives. And then what I've done over time is I've combined all the experience that I've found in psychotherapy, including what I find helpful and what I don't find helpful, my education, my clients' experiences, and my own personal experiences, and I've combined them and analysed them against each other to try to find fundamental explanations for the types of problems that people experience. And they do vary, explanations that apply to different people, not just one explanation that I can apply to everyone, but finding different explanations for different problems and different people's perspectives and how they play into it. And then in my own approach, what I try to do is ask clients the right questions, not just trying to ask the questions about the information I feel is most relevant, but asking clients the types of questions that are going to allow me to get a rich understanding of the different aspects of their life that could have contributed, and then looking at all these understandings with the client, analysing each of them with them collaboratively, not lecturing them, but collaboratively analysing each of them and discovering together which of these aspects of your life is most likely to have caused and could be perpetuating the problem. And then what's the psychological theory from the entire history of psychology that most likely explains it. And then once we know that, what can we do to change the situation or the problem for you? What can you do on a daily basis? Because a big part of it, which not everyone does, is psychoeducation, teaching people what some of the fundamental mechanics of the mind are and how we can use that to make the changes that we want to make.
Yes, I agree.
Exactly. And linking it and finally linking it to actions, because there are different approaches that have different arguments on this, but my approach is, in the end, humans are action focused beings. We take action. Every day we are doing different actions. That's unavoidable. So if we need to make a change, the best way to do it is to certainly have the right thoughts, but also have the right actions, because they don't just flow one way. Thoughts don't just influence actions, they're reciprocal. So taking specific action to change the situation is absolutely pivotal. Not all approaches necessarily do that, but seeing as we are agents and we do act on our environments and we do act in our lives, action is the best way forward.
I completely agree with everything that you've actually touched on, because even for myself, like through my own recovery journey, that was something that I really struggled with, even within our health systems here in Australia, is it was very much things were being segmented, right? So when I would come to people for like addiction issues, I would just be managed for those addiction issues. They weren't looking into like my trauma or my background or my lifestyle or like, what was going on. It was very like we're going to focus on this area and that's it. Whereas I feel like, as you said, there's so many key elements to why we're acting and thinking and behaving, the way that we are. And we really need to look at that big picture. We need to look at every single aspect of someone's life to be able to put all the puzzle pieces together. So I love that you've recognized that as well, and that you've put that into your own work. I think that's incredible. Now are you over in Melbourne? Is that right?
I am Melbourne, Victoria.
Yeah, perfect. And do you provide like online services and in person, or do you do a mixture?
I only provide online, the reason being that the lack of a cost associated with conducting sessions in person and having to factor in the cost of hiring a facility, it allows me to keep my prices reasonable. What it also allows me to do is offer concession discounts to make them more accessible for people who are on a tight budget.
Oh, perfect. Okay. We'll definitely dive more into that later on throughout this episode. But yeah, just wanted to quickly touch on that because, I think it's amazing that you're really countering all of these factors into your work. And I think, the more people that have access to your services, the better. So the another question I wanted to ask you was, it sounds like it's a very person-centered approach as well that you're doing. So can you elaborate on how person-centered and existential therapies influence your approach?
Certainly. Well, I consider the theories behind those two therapeutic approaches, even though they are considered to be approaches in their own right, I consider the theory that underlies each of them to be essential to any psychotherapeutic practice, regardless of what other modalities you apply. And there's a reason for each. So person-centered therapy can essentially be attributed to Dr. Carl Rogers. He was a clinical psychologist from the United States, and many years ago, unfortunately he's no longer with us, but many years ago, he recognized that there were certain factors that you had to enact as a therapist in order to truly help the client enact a change. And that involved being non-judgmental, regardless of how the client presented, not acting with any kind of negative emotion, but being willing to accept the client as they were, and being willing to allow the client to direct the therapist in terms of what they wanted to do and where they wanted the therapy to go. And he proposed that there were certain conditions that were necessary and sufficient for somebody to change. I argue that there are additional factors that need to be present in order for the change to be successful. However, those factors in and of themselves that he proposed are definitely necessary, because regardless of how the client's presenting and regardless of whether their behaviors are objectively rational or irrational, good or bad, neurologically we are primed, or we function more effective in terms of how our brain works when somebody else shows us empathy. Empathy actually has an evolutionary purpose. When somebody doesn't judge us but simply listens to us and demonstrates that they are listening and demonstrates that they are willing to hold a conversation with us without reacting negatively, our brain actually responds in such a way that it makes us easier to solve problems and also cope with any anxiety that might arise in the therapeutic process. So regardless of modality, that's a universal truth. Our brains work that way, and we have to be able to work with that in order to properly give somebody the conditions to change. The other aspect is existential therapy, and it's one of, again, the theories that I consider to be essential. The basic premise of existential therapy is that we all have choices, and we are the only entities in the universe that can take responsibility for our choices. In other words, we can never guarantee what's going to result from our actions, but we have to take responsibility for them. So the only choice we really have is to choose a particular action. We can't defer responsibility to somebody else. We have to be willing to take the risk in living and taking action, and then find ways to deal with the consequences. Now, again, I don't use existentialism in its entire form as a therapeutic modality, but the aspects of it that I argue are universally applicable are that as humans in a civilized world, we need to take responsibility for our actions. So there's never a guarantee in life, no matter how much work we spend, no matter how much effort we spend, no matter how much support we have, no matter what we do, the consequences of our actions are never guaranteed. How our life is going to work is never guaranteed. And also, there's no entity that is going to appear from nowhere and is going to take responsibility for us and defend us from negative consequences if the consequences that we yield are not to our liking or affect us negatively. In the end, we are all left to deal with those consequences. So part of overcoming a lot of problems is overcoming the anxiety associated with that, because something I've found to be the case in a lot of different mental illness presentations and even non-pathological or non-illness related situations where people are simply trying to overcome a problem is they want to change, but they know that change entails risk. And if they don't change, they have the comfort of knowing that the status quo is predictable to them. And if they change, they may yield positive consequences, but then there's a fear of the unknown, what negative consequences or undesirable consequences might come from the change. And so part of helping people in a lot of those cases, more often than not actually, is helping them to understand that regardless of what happens in life, you always have at least some choice, and you have to make some choice. Otherwise, if you give up choice and just let fate decide, then you're leaving a lot more to chance, and that could entail even bigger risks. So the better solution is to actually analyze your choices and then decide based on careful analysis which one is most likely to be beneficial to you. Even if your choice is to stay where you are, at least you've analyzed each choice and you have a reason within yourself. You're empowering your own mind to be in a better position to make that choice, an informed choice.
Thank you so much for that. It's always so fascinating, hearing about the way that we work as human beings and just how complex we are. Such complex
Indeed.
creatures. But yeah, and it's really interesting because there's people that walk very different paths in the sense that, people might be more like unaware of their own actions, might lack the ability to be able to self-reflect or take accountability for a lot of their actions and behaviors. And then there's other people that are willing to tread into that space, like, being a little bit more accepting of that space of the unknown and kind of giving into that, surrendering to the fear in a sense and allowing things to kind of just evolve. So it's really fascinating to see what kind of drives us as humans. So thank you so much for sharing that, John. I wanted to actually ask you as well, like in your experience, like what are the most common misconceptions about psychotherapy?
I can't speak statistically to this. I don't know how many people in a given society believe this, but one of the intuitions that I have is that a lot of people might believe that psychotherapy is a relatively passive process, that it works like prescription drugs, in which they receive passively the therapist's advice, and then just by undertaking a few simple actions, the therapeutic present is all of a sudden going to help them change, that there are tricks, there are secrets. But that is quite far from the truth. Therapy is quite an active process, and I'm not going to lie, it is a difficult process. Any change, as I said, involves facing the anxiety of not knowing what consequences the change is going to have, and whether the consequences are going to be desirable to you, whether they're going to be undesirable, whether what everyone says about the action you're considering taking is going to happen, or whether it's not going to happen. Where can you go for information? And if the worst happens, is anyone going to be able to help you overcome the consequences? So that is an active process. It's carefully understanding how your mind works and then taking actions that usually are uncomfortable, deliberately going against what you're comfortable doing in order to enact the change. Another misconception might be that psychotherapists all work from the same school of thought. And this is mostly perpetuated by mainstream media and films and television programs and books and stories, in which the therapist is essentially conveyed as someone who simply analyzes your childhood and tells you what's wrong with you. As I said, there are a number of different psychotherapeutic modalities, hundreds possibly, and they all work from slightly different perspectives. The idea that it's a passive process, though, even though proper psychotherapy is a very active process, unfortunately, I think what might be perpetuating it is that a lot of therapists can be a bit passive, and I've heard that from I've heard that from multiple clients that they've tried seeing psychologists, traditional psychotherapists, and they haven't been impressed by the passive approach. In their words, tell me more, just asking the client to speak without actually helping them process the information. And they've sought my service as an alternative to that. And so I've taken it upon myself to use that active approach to help them actually make sense of the information and then translate it into action. But the most common misconception is that it's you passively receive the therapy. But in order for any therapy to be effective, to enact change, you have to be an active participant in it, and you have to do things that are going to make you feel uncomfortable.
I could not agree more, John. And that's something that I do come across a lot, like whether that's with friends, family, or, just my own experiences too, is that I find if you lack the understanding of what psychotherapy is and what is available to you as well, it can be really hard to navigate those systems, especially if you're engaging with someone, who is acting from one modality or is, I guess not addressing or educating you probably is the best way to put it on all the things that you can have access to and work on. But I've often seen that people have had this idea that when they go to therapy, that person's going to fix all their problems. So it's very much not taking that responsibility in, having to take action themselves. And I see that a lot. And this is where people get stuck, right? They go into these cycles and they end up, going into therapy, and maybe it's merely talk therapy. Maybe they are just, expressing how they're feeling, and that's kind of just taking them around in circles. Like there's no actions coming from that to change the behavior. And, and then people get, start to wonder, why am I not feeling any better? Like this therapist is useless. They're not helping me. So yeah, that's something that I see a lot of. Would you agree that's something you see as well?
I intuit that it's an issue, and it was an issue for me in my early stages of psychotherapy. And what's also important to realize is, again, I can't say statistically how often this happens, but I'd say that also sometimes, because people enter therapy with that assumption, it influences how they perceive the therapist's actions. And so the therapist might be gently trying to persuade them to, challenge themselves and do something with that information. And maybe because they're influenced to see the therapist as a passive listener, that they're not seeing also the way they're trying to gently explain to them that what could be done with that information and what they could personally do.
Yeah, I know, I agree. And that's when you can kind of box yourself, right? And really limit yourself to the information that you can receive. So that's something that I even personally experienced when I first started going into therapy. But mind you, I was still in an active addiction when I was going to therapy. It was very much a checkbox thing for me, and get off my back, I'm going to therapy. But I wasn't really doing any of the work. I was not being honest with my therapist. She didn't know half the things that I was getting up to. So she wasn't even equipped with the right information and the knowledge to be able to assist me properly either. So that's another thing too. It's you have to be honest as well with and present all that information so they can actually provide the best service to you. Our guest speaker, Caroline Bruni, is a trauma survivor coach and breathwork facilitator based on the Gold Coast, and supports her clients to regulate their nervous system, get in touch with their mind, body, and spirit, and work through their trauma using coaching and the somatic power of breathwork. With her trained therapy dog, Louie, Caroline holds in-person breathwork sessions on the Gold Coast for groups and individuals, and online sessions for those who aren't based on the Gold Coast. So if you're someone who's wanted to give breathwork a go but hasn't really known where to start, Caroline might be the person to support you. With monthly online sessions and various in-person sessions available, it's time to experience the power of breathwork. So just head to www.carolinebruni.com and check out the breathwork page to book a session today. How do you view the role of, communication skills in psychotherapy, and what strategies do you employ to enhance these skills in your clients?
Communication, as much as it's been said already, is everything in psychotherapy. You have to be able to speak the client's language. As somebody, a fantastic social worker by the name of Simon Rinne actually once said to me, he said, you have to be able to speak that person's language, metaphysical language. And often communication isn't just about your vocabulary and how well you're able to express the ideas from an objective standpoint. It's how well you're able to understand what the client is communicating to you, being able to interpret their experiences without placing your own personal bias on it. In other words, being able to understand what the client must be experiencing just from the words they're able to use, and do that accurately, and then communicate back to them that you've understood, and then also be able to explain the strategies in a way that would make sense from their frame of reference. So to give an example, something that's often not discussed often enough in the mental health realm, which is surprising to me considering any psychologist should be able to tell you about it, is executive functioning. And executive functioning is simply the ability of the brain to undertake basic thinking tasks like retrieving memories, processing the information that's coming in, and then making decisions based on it. That's executive functioning. We usually don't realize it, but we use this functioning in every aspect of our daily lives. Often what is not explained in the pop culture on mental health is mental illnesses aren't just bad feelings or bad thoughts, right? Depression's a good example because it's a common condition. Depression isn't just feeling sad and not feeling like doing anything. When it gets severe enough, what actually happens is the feelings are so intensive that they affect executive functioning, and that's why people often have what we refer to as brain fog, or not being able to think. What's actually happening is the parts of the brain that are responsible for retrieving information from long-term memory on something as simple as how to wash your hands or make your bed, if it's this severe, the parts of the brain that are responsible for that are actually impeded by the illness, which is why people experience that brain fog. They feel like that they're trying to think deliberately, but their brain just doesn't want to. The problem is the depression is impeding executive functioning, but we don't often explain it like that. We just say, oh, depression makes you feel bad and you don't want to do anything as a result, which is why a lot of people also, this is something that really makes me bawl, as you can imagine, but when people also say that depression, anxiety, and similar illnesses aren't real, or that, you know, the number of people that say they suffer from it don't actually suffer from it, that a lot of people are malingerers. But none of these people understand what the role of executive functioning is and how it actually happens. Now, I'm certainly not a neurologist or a neurophysiologist, so if you wanted information on specifically what's happening at the brain level, then I would suggest consulting some professionals and, you know, MRI studies that can demonstrate what is happening during bouts of depression, although even that can be quite complex in itself. But that's something that you need to be able to communicate to your client in order to understand, to show them that you understand what's happening. And so what I often do is, if a client's depressed, I'll ask them, okay, let's examine the experience. What happened when you wanted to do a certain task? How did you feel inside? What were your thoughts? How do you describe your feelings? And then might describe the brain fog. And I might say, it sounds as though that task you wanted to do was like trying to knock down a brick wall, and you had to pull one brick out of the wall, but you couldn't figure out which it was because there were 1,000 bricks. And no matter how hard you tried, you couldn't find a side of the brick wall to walk around. You couldn't find a way to climb over it. You couldn't find which brick was the one to pull out because they all looked the same. Sounds as though you just couldn't retrieve that information. And I go, yes, that's what it feels like. And say, okay. And I imagine that when you tried to do something, the pain of doing it because you couldn't think of any information was so intensive that you decided to just go back to bed because that felt more comfortable. Much like you put your hand on a hot stove and the pain was so much that you just couldn't help but jerk it away. You know, if you had have kept your hand there, you would have suffered so much that you couldn't bear not to jerk it away. That makes sense. Okay, we understand a frame of reference. This is how we explain it in neurological terms. Executive functioning. Every time you do something simple, you have to retrieve information from long-term memory, and depression impedes that. All of a sudden, these bad feelings, so to speak, make sense to someone who's never had it explained to them that way. but it's because not just I've studied, but I've suffered depression for a long time, and I know what the feeling is like. And I've analysed my own experience against other clients' experiences, and I've come to the conclusion that that is the most probably the most accessible way to explain the mechanics of it. Once you understand that, then you can take action, because then you know why you're doing what you're doing.
Yeah, thank you so much for explaining that, because I actually haven't even had anyone explain it to me in that concept before. And it makes perfect sense. I'm sure there'll be listeners tuning in who will suddenly have a bit of a light bulb moment just from hearing that, because I love that it's very matter of fact, but it's so true. That is how we respond. And I think there's also a misconception with depression as well, in the sense of, there is clinical depression, right? And that's when you've been depressed for long periods of time. And then there's, I don't know, would you call it depression if someone was merely like reacting to an event or something that was happening in their life?
I probably wouldn't personally, the reason being that we have clinical language to describe specific phenomena, and when we start expanding the terms, the meanings of those terms too broadly, they become increasingly less precise. So
Yeah.
the reason we have that terminology is so that when we're communicating with other people, if we use that term, we know specifically what it refers to.
Yeah, and I think that's what people get really confused about, is that, they might be thinking that they're depressed, whereas it might be more circumstantial, and they might not be having those effects with their executive function. Whereas like clinical depression definitely experiences that. Like I've had that myself. I remember I didn't even get out of bed for like 3 weeks at one point. I didn't like showering, was hating getting dressed. And it was really hard to just describe to people what was going on in my head, because everything was just shutting down. And I didn't know what to do. It was really, really tough to navigate. So I wish someone could have explained it to me like that at that point in time, because that would have made me feel a little bit more assured of what was happening in my mind, because I literally thought I was just losing it.
Well, to anyone out there who's having the same experience and maybe having some doubts, please seek help. It's not too late. Speak to your treating practitioner.
Yes, thank you, John. So I wanted to ask you as well, what is your perspective on the integration of mental health support with life coaching, especially regarding like setting and achieving life goals?
Part of being an effective life coach in my professional evaluation is understanding the underlying mechanics of the human mind and human psychology. And so that understanding can actually be just as effective for mental health support as it is for setting and achieving goals that don't necessarily have anything to do with mental health. As a life coach, I provide mental health support mainly because that's one of my areas of skill. My training has allowed me to do that. My experiences have allowed me to do that. And often one of the missing factors that can be missing from some psychotherapy approaches is the goal setting part that is key to overcoming mental health challenges. So even if somebody has a mental illness and they want to overcome the challenges that are associated with it, one of the key strategies is goal setting strategies, because as I said, we are humans, we are active participants in our environment, and only by doing that can we maximize our chances of obtaining the outcomes we want. So it's even in a mental health context or a mental illness context, it's essential that we take the approach of helping the client to set goals that are reasonable and achievable for them, and that are going to help them achieve what they want to achieve. And that's the main intersection where life coaching tends to be focused on goals. And I'd say in and of itself, there may be some flaws in some of the approaches that people use, whereas traditional psychotherapy may be somewhat too passive on the other end of the spectrum. Combining both is essential in that case, because without the understanding, a person doesn't know why they're doing what they're doing. But without the goals, they're not doing anything.
Yes, thank you so much for sharing that. I think it's a really vital approach, actually, and it's quite a holistic approach as well, which kind of leads me into my next question was, how do you address the holistic needs of a client? And I know we've actually already touched on this a little bit, but let's go a little bit deeper, like considering their mental, emotional and their social well-being?
Those different aspects all can influence each other, and there's a number of different concepts in psychology. One of them can actually be read into, if anyone's interested, the Canadian psychologist Albert Bandura. I think he may have left us, may rest in peace. He, I believe, coined a term known as reciprocal determinism. And reciprocal determinism simply means that different aspects of our situation can influence each other. The influence is not one way. So in a mental health context, if we want to make it holistic, the reason for that is every aspect of our life, or a number of aspects of our life, might be influencing each other in a way that perpetuates the challenges that we're experiencing. Even on a purely individual level, if somebody is behaving in ways that are not allowing them to achieve their goals, and as a result they're not achieving their goals, the feedback they're receiving from their actions and the environment, seeing as their goals have to do with their interaction with the world, not just themselves, is, I can't achieve my goals. That worsens their thoughts, makes their thoughts decidedly negative, because the persistent thought is going to be that I can't achieve my goals, I've tried and the results have never been desirable, which is going to make them feel sad, maybe angry, maybe resentful, maybe hopeless. But then feeling those feelings and thinking those thoughts is going to alter their mind's functioning in such a way that they're inadvertently influencing the effort that they spend on the actions. So the actions are of lower quality than what they like, which means that they're consistently not going to achieve the goals, which reinforces the thoughts. But instead, if we understand each of those aspects, and the client then does, and then we set specific goals that allow them to address each of them, that is to say, changing the way they act so that the results are different, and then using the results to reinforce their thoughts, and also changing their thoughts in a way that's appropriate to reinforce the actions and the feelings, then we've covered more of the problem surface, so to speak. So we're enhancing the solution from a variety of perspectives, not just one. And then when we look at other aspects like physical health, for example, I'm not a physiologist, so physical health isn't my area of expertise, but the fuel that we give ourselves, our food and our eating habits, and other habits like our consumption of alcohol, smoking, use of drugs, those are going to influence how our brain works, and how our brain works is then going to dictate our thoughts and our feelings, and then they have an influence on behavior, and then that also has a reciprocal influence on thoughts and feelings. So that aspect has to be integrated, and we can set specific goals about how we can change our eating habits to change what the consequences are. And then that extends to exercise habits, that extends to social habits, how we interact with other people. All of those aspects influence each other. The influence is not unidirectional. So holistic practice means addressing all of those functions when it's appropriate to do so. That's why I emphasize the importance of asking questions and also acknowledging what isn't said by the client, because maybe the client hasn't thought to tell you something. It's not that necessarily they're withholding. Maybe they just haven't thought to tell you, or maybe they're concerned about talking about something. They're scared that they might be judged, or they don't want to think about it themselves. And we have to deal with that sensitively, because we need to respect the client. But at the same time, if we can identify what's not being said and find the missing pieces of the puzzle, we can help the client to understand how each of these different aspects of their life is influencing them, and how they can actually change them consciously using strategies that are achievable for them. Contrast that to traditional psychotherapy, or some types, I should say, not all types, but some types of traditional psychotherapy in which we're only focusing on one aspect of the problem. We're likely to miss parts of it. We're likely to miss a valuable opportunity to teach the person how to actually make a meaningful change in their life.
Thank you so much, John. And considering all of this information and everything you're putting into your own practices, what are your thoughts on the current state of our mental health services here in Australia? What are your personal opinions on what's been happening here?
Well, I have a number of major concerns about it. One of them isn't necessarily to do with the mental health. It may be to do with the mental health system, but it's probably more complex than just one government department or one policy.
Of course, yes.
The concern that I have, which I've expressed before, is that there is a large inconsistency in the ethics that practitioners have. I've had some practitioners that are humble and that allow me dignity of risk, which means they allow me to choose how I receive the treatment, how I engage with them, whether to work on certain problems. I mean, considering I'm not a danger to anyone else and I'm capable of taking control of my own behaviours, they consider it safe for me to choose the direction of therapy. They listen, they communicate that they listen, and they're not fake. Like they respond in a way that is human. They bring out their human side. I've had some other practitioners that are quite posh and detached. They make me feel like I'm just a broken person. Some people are a little bit patronizing. Some people only focus on one aspect of the problem and force me to talk about aspects that I know just aren't relevant, or maybe that I would have talked about anyway. And they're forcing me to take a direction that doesn't allow me to fully communicate what I need. One practitioner even ceased to provide services to me because at the time I couldn't attend their office in person because I had to work full time, and I didn't have I just didn't have the time to attend in person, but I wanted to consult with them via video conference. And they said, no, I don't think that you'll be vulnerable enough, and I think you may be trying to find a way to self-sabotage the therapy, so I don't feel
Oh
it's
my
safe. I don't feel it's
goodness.
safe. Considering your problems, John, I don't feel it's safe for you to be consulting via video conference. I'll give you the names of some other people and I'll refer you on to someone else. Which, one of the major criticisms I have, which I won't rant about it because it's not relevant to the topic, but we do tend to espouse relatively progressive views in the mental health space, but we don't practice them, because that type of behavior very much recreates the type of oppressive conditions that these people tend to rail against. Okay, the patriarchy, capitalism. I'm not going to comment on these things individually because it's a complex conversation, but we oppose, capitalism, patriarchy. We oppose, abuse. Well, I have PTSD, and what you've just done has replicated the power imbalance that caused me to suffer that. So congratulations, you're now part of the problem. But then, a lot of them tend to distance themselves. So there's that. But also, as I've said in the past, there's a disconnect between, as you found, a disconnect between the systems. One system like Medicare might see mental health care as being conceptualized by treatment of a medical condition, treatment of an illness. The NDIS conceptualizes it as capacity building. In reality, the correct approach will encompass all of those aspects. But in pop culture, I jokingly call it pop culture, but we tend to engage in reification. In other words, we take a concept and say, just because we can think about something that way, this is how we're going to treat it as if it exists in real life. And when we limit ourselves that way, we don't ask questions about all aspects of the problem. We only choose one aspect and say, this system is about this, therefore we're going to do this. And it doesn't address all the problem, and ultimately it doesn't produce the change. Those are the two main gripes that I have.
Yeah, and I agree with you there. I actually do feel like we need more of a community framework where a lot of these other sections are talking to each other, because that's one thing that I find a lot of is, even in like addiction or mental health, a lot of these services, like, yes, some are collaboratively working together, but a lot of them are very like you versus me. Like it's not a very community centered approach. Like, I just feel like there's so much more that we can be doing where we're working alongside each other and helping each other out, where I just see a huge divide. There's a massive divide. It's very you versus me, and I just don't see that as being helpful. So like, even for when I eventually do launch my own like addiction treatment and services, I hope to be able to even work alongside you, John. Like, and there could be people that can come through to me that might have needs that are out of my scope. Like, and I don't want to just leave them in a lurch. I think that's the wrong way to go about it, and it's all about that, looking at the big picture, seeing everything that they need and making sure all those needs are met. So yeah, that's my thought on it anyway.
And likewise, it's not you or me, it's you and me.
Yes, yeah. And I really think we've got that wrong at the moment, but I really hope, I know there's been conversations kind of started about this, and there is a lot more talk in regards to changing that framework, but I just don't think we will see it in a physical form for quite some time yet. I mean, it's going to take a while to initiate all these new approaches. But Before we actually wrap up today, I wanted to talk a little bit more around your services, your listener, and your coaching. So can you tell us a little bit about what services that you have available at the moment and what the costs are involved, if you would like to divulge that?
Absolutely. So your listener has existed in some form for approximately the last 4 years, and now it's a formal business. It's a business operating in Australia, and I work via either telephone or video conference to provide life coaching to people all over Australia. Considering that I work remotely, and as I said, the fact that I work only remotely allows me to make my pricing as accessible as possible. So all new clients receive, first and foremost, a free 15-minute introductory consultation via telephone. It's completely obligation free. It allows me to assess and understand your needs and whether I'm the right person to help you achieve your goals. Following that, I offer 2 types of sessions. They can be either a 90-minute session or a 60-minute session. The 90-minute sessions are $199 for regular pricing, or if you have a concession card, a government-issued concession card, including a seniors card, they're $119. And a 60-minute session is $149 at standard pricing or $89 at concession pricing. And as I've discussed with you today, Paris, I work using traditional therapeutic modalities as a basis because they're the ones that have the evidence behind them. I use evidence-based practices, and I help the person to understand what it is that they want to achieve, articulate that, then understand the psychological mechanics that are acting as a barrier to it, and then I help them create strategies that involve concrete action, again, based on evidence-based practice. And then we assess regularly, and the client ultimately, unlike some coaching services that require a 4-figure commitment right from the start, the client ultimately has choice about how long they use my services. If, hypothetically, they were done in one session and felt they had what they needed, they'd be good to go. Otherwise, they can book as many sessions or as few sessions as they want. You only have to pay for what you choose to take. And I work with people on a range of different problems, everything from mental health support and psychoeducation, educating about how the mind works, all the way through to the development of a variety of different planning and life skills, communication skills, social skills. Couples, I'm happy to work with both individuals and couples as well. Relationship building skills, rapport building skills, communication, life skills like planning, organising and budgeting, although I'm not a financial advisor, the basic budgeting process I can certainly help with. And really understanding the mechanics of a well-organised life, if that's where you choose to take it.
Beautiful. Thank you so much for that. So for any of our listeners out there, if they were wanting to engage in your services, where's the best place for them to find you?
They can contact me either via email which is your.listener.coaching@gmail.com, or they can contact me via telephone on 0402 333 950. However, I believe the link to my website will be in the show notes. Paris, they can contact me via my website. My details are there. That also has links to my podcast, which is on various platforms, and my Instagram page and my Linktree, and all of those platforms on which I produce content. They all have a link to my website or my contact details in some way. So any place you choose to access, you'll be able to find my email address or my phone number.
Perfect. And I do actually have a guest speaker profile for you on my newly launched website, which I haven't even announced yet.
Thank you.
But you're already up there, so all your links are in there. Yeah, no worries. And I'll definitely put links in the descriptions as well on every platform that this will be streaming on, as well as links to your podcast, of course, which will also be a fascinating listen for people as well. Now, before we say goodbye, I wanted to quickly ask, because I do have such a diverse audience as well coming through here. I actually have a large audience in the US at the moment. If someone was interested in working with you and they were international, would you still accept would you accept them?
That's a good question. At the moment, I only work with Australian clients, the reason being that there are cross-jurisdictional and legal barriers that might make it difficult for me to ethically and honestly work with somebody overseas, because I have to work within the laws that Australia states, and other countries might have restrictions on who can practice life coaching or the types of activities in which a life coach can engage. And of course, me only having access to legal advice in Australia within an Australian legal context means that the information that I can do to safely service someone, the information that I can get is somewhat limited. However, I'm happy to take inquiries, but unfortunately my legal ability to practice outside of Australia at the moment is severely limited, and I'd rather be honest about that up front than potentially lead someone into a situation that's going to cause a problem.
Perfect. No, thank you so much, John. I wanted to ask anyway, just in case. And thank you so much for coming on the show. This has been such an insightful conversation. I've learned a lot myself, and I know our listeners will too. So thank you again for coming on.
My pleasure, Paris, and thank you so much for having me. I've really enjoyed conversing with you.
Thank you so much, John. Well, I'll be in touch with you soon anyway, but I hope you have a wonderful day.
Thanks, Paris.